Hi, I'm Thomas Bowles, Prince William County Agricultural Extension Agent. Welcome to our video.
Good morning, everyone. My name's Thomas Bowles. I'm the Extension Agent here in Prince William County, and this week's presentation is going to be on sweet potatoes. So, first of all, when we talk about potatoes, we need to distinguish between typically three different actual plants. The sweet potato, which I have no idea how to pronounce its genus name, but its species name is Batata. It's a morning glory. It's an edible root. It was originated in South America. The Andean potato, which is sometimes called the Irish potato, is an edible tuber, and it's in the nightshade family. So its close relatives would be things like tomatoes and eggplant. The Spanish called it batata because they thought it looked like sweet potatoes, and that eventually became potato in English. Yams, which are often confused with sweet potatoes, are actually more closely related to lilies than sweet potatoes or Andean potatoes. It's an edible tuber in the yam family, and it's of African origin. So sometimes these get used interchangeably, but particularly the sweet potato and the yam, but the sweet potato is a whole different section of that family. So a little history. Sweet potatoes have been cultivated for centuries in South America. By 16th century in Europe, it was considered an aphrodisiac. The term sweet potato became popular in the mid 18th century to distinguish it from the Andean potato. George Washington Carver, although he's famous for all the research he did with peanuts, he did a great deal of research on how to grow sweet potatoes and how to use sweet potatoes. By the late 1800s, Americans started serving candied potato dishes, and then just after World War I, the first candied sweet potatoes with marshmallow recipe was published and soon became a Thanksgiving classic. So there are a lot of reasons to eat sweet potatoes. They're high in vitamin C, B6, vitamin A, potassium, and fiber. And they're roughly 114 grams, a normal serving of 114 grams is roughly 112 calories. So they're generally low cal. There are all sorts of varieties of sweet potatoes. Skin colors come in brown, oranges, reds, purple. The flesh colors can also be different color. Most of them are orange, but they're also white, yellow, and purple varieties. There are yam type sweet potatoes, and they have a more moist mouthfeel than regular sweet potatoes, but they are not yams. I have listed here a couple of the more popular varieties that get grown. Beauregard is the standard. Any sweet potato farm you come in contact with is likely to have at least a few Beauregards. They're relatively short season for sweet potato. And it's a classic shape and color that we expect from what we get at the supermarket. Muraskis are a Japanese variety. They're a little bit longer to maturity. They have red-purple skin with white flesh. Henry is one that's being grown more and more. It takes about 100 days to reach maturity. It has a tan brown skin, kind of like an Andean potato with white flesh. Covington is popular because it's a shorter season variety, and it can be copper to rose colored skin with orange flesh. And there are all purple varieties. And then there's the Puerto Rico variety that is really good for small gardens because it's a very compact plant and doesn't have things going everywhere. It doesn't have vines going everywhere. And if we look at those, here's a classic Beauregard. You know, this is the shape and the color you expect when you go to the grocery store in most cases. Covington's a little more reddish orange. The all purple, like I said, is all purple, and it actually stays purple. When you boil it, there are some purple varieties that will leach out the coloring, but all purple stays purple. Yo Henry, which again kind of looks like an Andean potato. The Murasaki are long and narrow, and then the Puerto Rico. So how do you grow sweet potatoes? Well, you start with slips. We don't plant seeds for sweet potatoes because it would take forever, and sweet potatoes like a long, hot growing season. So you can get slips, and over here on the left, excuse me, on the right, my other left, you have a picture of a sweet potato slip. They're available commercially through many seed companies, Johnny's, Southern Exposure, Territorial, a whole bunch of them. The big trick with those is you got to order early, and then typically they'll ship them out about the time that you should be planting them in your particular area. It's hit or miss at the box stores or local farm store, co-op, whether you can find sweet potato varieties. A lot of times you can't, but occasionally you can. But it's really easy to grow your own slips. And so there are a couple ways you can do it. And the first way we'll show you is in late winter. You take the sweet potatoes, you cut them in half, place the ends in water, and you let the plants develop into slips. They'll sprout. You can see over here on the right. You snap those off and you either put them in a glass of water to form more roots, or you can put them in potting soil, moist potting soil. And then you want to set each slip in so that the crown, this part right here, is about an inch deep into the soil, and allow it to root, and then put it out when it's the normal time for your particular area. And we'll get to when that is in a moment. The other way to do it, and this is an example of a Murasaki sweet potato, our colleagues at the University of Maryland came up with this. You basically cover a flat with a couple inches of soil. You slice the sweet potato lengthwise. You place them cut side down, and you cover them with soil, another 1 to 2 inches. Keep it in a warm, moist place. Put plastic over it until you start getting leaf growth. Then you remove the plastic and grow them under cool fluorescent tubes or LEDs, giving them 14 to 16 hours a day. When you snap them off from the mother plant or the mother root, they're typically rootless, and that's okay. You just stick those again in soil and allow those to develop roots. And then you plant them after all danger of frost. And there's a nice video on how to do this at the Maryland Extension site, or this is the YouTube site that it connects to. So if you're really interested in growing your own slips, it's an excellent video. So again, we're growing them from slips, not seeds. Ideally, they should have 6 to 7 nodes, and nodes are these swollen areas on the stem and root, and you plant them about 4 inches deep. Sweet potatoes love hot weather. And one of the problems, the farther north you go, the harder it is to grow sweet potatoes. Here in Northern Virginia, we can grow them pretty well. We want to stay on the shorter side to maturity, but we can grow them fairly well here. One thing you can do to help is to preheat the soil, and the way to do that is to lay black plastic down in the bed that you're going to plant sweet potatoes in, and give it about 2 weeks for the sun to pound in there and get that energy in there and warm that soil up, and then you can plant them. But you want to make sure that you plant them after all danger of frost, and ideally when nighttime temperatures are about 60 degrees Fahrenheit. Sometimes you can go a little bit less if you've warmed up the soil. Sometimes, if it's super cold and rainy like we've had a lot of seasons recently, you have to push back when you're going to plant, and that really affects your yield. You want to space them I usually do about 12 inches apart, and then put them in rows about 3 to 5 feet apart. It's important to keep these watered well, especially the first 2 months. They're really drought sensitive in those first 2 months, and the plants can easily die. But you don't want to overwater them either. You want to water deeply and regularly through dry periods as the season goes on. Again, early on, excessive water causes root rot, but later in the season, if you water excessively, you're going to have splits like we see on the picture here on the right of the sweet potatoes. When we talk about sweet potato pests, when it comes to weeds, for the most part, the vines are going to smother out any weeds. Weeds usually are not a big problem, except when they're very young. There are several diseases that affect commercial growers, but we rarely see this in home production. You're usually not doing it intensely enough, and usually not doing it in the same place over and over again, so the diseases aren't really that much of a concern. We do see a lot of flea beetles attacking sweet potatoes, but they seem to have little impact on the yield. They damage the leaves, but otherwise they don't really do a whole lot. White grubs can feed on the roots, and they can cause problems, but typically white grubs, if you're rotating your crops, you're not going to see a whole lot of those. Slugs, earwigs, and voles all feed on the roots. That's a problem. One of the things as you get into the fall that you can run into is if you leave them in the ground a little too long, the slugs in particular will start going after them. At our demonstration garden in Bristow, typically it's slug damage that we see. We don't have a lot of issues with earwigs or voles on sweet potatoes. The vines themselves, our lagomorph friends, the rabbits, groundhogs, deer, they'll all feed on the vines, and so you have to protect them some way. Typically, chicken wire cage is handy if any of those three are a problem in your area. So just a little comparison to how Andean potatoes and sweet potatoes grow. With Andean potatoes, we use a starter seed potato. We bury it deep, and potatoes grow up. With a sweet potato, it chandeliers, and so we plant our slip, and then it begins to have these cascades of sweet potatoes, and as it grows along at nodes, it will drop down these storage roots. And so at the very end, when you're harvesting, you'll have fewer potatoes, but ideally, you'll have a really good chandelier system in the first couple feet of your sweet potato vines. And this is an example of the chandelier type that I'm talking about. Maturity dates vary, and it's really important, like I said, depending on where you are, to make sure you've got a sweet potato that's going to grow in your growing season. Ideally, you want to get them harvested before soil temperatures drop to 50, but you definitely want to get them harvested before you go to frost. Depending on how long you leave them in the ground and what variety they are, they can get very large. But the ideal market size, if you're selling them, is 6 to 9 inches and less than 3.5 inches in diameter. We found in home gardens, you can get some really monster sweet potatoes if you leave it in long enough. Yields run about 45 pounds per 100 square feet. which, like Andean potatoes, make them a pretty good investment in space in your garden in terms of producing calories for you. After you harvest them, just like with Andean potatoes, you want to let them cure for a while. Give them about a week. They can be in warm temperatures, but you want them in a well-ventilated dark room, and that's going to toughen their skins, and it's going to allow them to be stored for a longer period. And then once that's done, you want to put them in long-term storage. That should be at a much lower temperature, 55 degrees or above, with as little handling as possible, because you don't want to damage those still somewhat fragile skins. When it comes to preparing sweet potatoes, there are lots of different ways you can cook them. But from a food safety standpoint, you want to wash your hands before handling your vegetables, any of them, but sweet potatoes we're talking about. Then you want to rinse them under a stream of cool water. You don't want to throw them in a bowl of cool water. You want to rinse them under running water. That way, if you put them in a bowl, what's going to happen is if you've got disease or some other problem on one potato, it's going to spread to all of them. If you rinse them under cold water, it gets rinsed down the drain. And you want to scrub them to remove any dirt or debris. Like I said, they could be prepared in a lot of different ways. They can be boiled, which is helpful in retaining the beta carotene in them. They can be roasted, which is my favorite way, or they can be fried. Several of the white flesh varieties can be used as substitute for Andean potatoes because they're not quite as sweet. And they are suitable for canning and freezing for longer term storage. If you're interested in canning or freezing sweet potatoes, I would direct you to the National Center for Food Preservation. It will have recipes and will give you instructions on how to do it safely. So, what questions do you have about sweet potatoes and growing sweet potatoes? Are there any questions in the chat box, Christina?
Let's see. Yes, Kirsten asked about recommendations for flea beetle control.
Ignore them. I've seen flea beetle damage in sweet potatoes on the leaves, but they really don't do significant damage to the plants, and it's really not going to reduce your yield. So I wouldn't worry about trying to deal with them. I would just let them go. They're not going to get out of hand. And then you want to make sure that you don't plant them near other vegetables that are flea beetle sensitive.
Can you grow sweet potatoes in a bag or a bucket if space is limited?
As long as it's a deep bag or a deep bucket. Because remember, if we go back, they're going to chandelier down. So if you have, a 5-gallon bucket, it's only going to be able to fill that 5-gallon bucket, for example. Also, it's going to vine, so you're going to have all these vines that don't have any soil to attach to, and so all these extra storage roots aren't going to be there for you. But yes, you can do that.
So what about the other crops with flea beetles and them spreading? What are some of those crops?
Potatoes tend to have, Andean potatoes tend to have more trouble with flea beetles. Let's see, eggplant can be affected by them, but eggplant, like sweet potatoes, don't seem to mind flea beetle damage. Tomatoes sometimes can get flea beetle damage on their leaves. I'd keep them away from nightshades in general.
Okay, do you think that darker versions are healthier and they have more vitamins?
So it depends on what vitamin you're looking at. If they're vitamins that are related to beta carotene, then the colored varieties are going to have more of that. If you're looking as a general profile, they tend to have similar nutritional value. What was the second part of that question? Did I miss that?
For example, more vitamins. So do you think darker versions are healthier,
Okay.
i.e. more vitamins?
For some reason, I was thinking that that was a multi-part question. Sorry. No, I think you're fine. Doesn't matter whether you go with white flesh or dark flesh.
When you harvest them, how much should you clean them? Should you wait for the dirt to dry and then brush it off?
Ideally, yes, unless you've got big clumps on it.
What causes diseased potatoes and how do you prevent it?
Depends on the disease. Typically, it's fungal. It's not really common in home gardens. I would have to look up specific diseases to tell you how to prevent them. But most fungal diseases thrive in humid conditions.
Do the sweet potato vines sold as ornamentals produce edible tubers?
Yes, but not many. If you think about how they're sold, they're typically sold in a hanging basket. And so, again, that goes back to I'm going to grow them in a bucket. So the hanging basket's very shallow, so there's not a lot of space for a root to develop. All of the extra vining is not in contact with soil, so you're not going to have any of that extra. They tend to be a more pale color, so they don't photosynthesize as much. And the tubers that, or excuse me, the roots that form, because they are roots, tend to be kind of spindly and not really worth the effort.
What soil conditions do they do best in? The pH level? What pH level?
It depends. So soil conditions in general, you want a looser soil if possible. But when you look at pH, there are some older varieties that are disease prone that they grow at a lower pH, like 5.2. That's typically in commercial settings, and that's typically to fight off disease. In most cases, the newer varieties, and in most home situations, about 6 to 6.5 pH, and they'll do fine.
When you mean growing with the nightshade family or near the nightshade family, is this referring to a garden in the ground as opposed to urban style? Meaning pots and not
Okay.
in the ground.
So when you're growing stuff in the ground, you tend to make the most of that ground, and you tend to have plants more compacted in a more compacted area. When you're growing them in pots, you tend to have them separated a little bit. There's more airflow, and you tend not to have as many plants. And so we're talking in the ground, in the garden. That's where I'd keep them away from nightshades. If you've got a tomato or a pepper growing and on your patio, and you have a large pot that you're growing sweet potatoes in, it shouldn't be a problem.
Okay, don't see any.
Sweet potatoes are really easy to grow. And if you've never grown them before, it's worth a shot. We're coming up on planting season. I know at our demonstration garden, we put slips in last Thursday, but you've got a couple week window. So if you want to try sweet potatoes and you have slips or know of a place that you can get slips, I'd give it a shot. Like I say, they can produce quite a bit of actual sweet potato in a relatively small space. 100 square feet can produce almost 50 pounds. So it's worth trying, especially if you like sweet potatoes.
There's a comment, not a question. There's a series on Netflix about African American cuisine called High on the Hog. And in one of the episodes, they talk a lot about yams and sweet potatoes. That was from Rick Snyder.
Interesting. I'll have to check that out.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. I don't know a whole lot about yam culture because typically we don't grow them in Virginia, although I want to think yams have a longer growing season than is practical here. But I will have to check that out. Thank you, Rick.
I will be sending out the link for the recording and an evaluation for this session by Friday. We'd appreciate very much if you could fill out the evaluation for us. It helps us when we're giving more classes on what you think and where we need to improve. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody. We'll see you next week. I can't remember what we're doing next week, but we'll be on again.
Invasives. Next week is invasives. And
That's
in
right.
2 weeks, we have Ask a Master Gardener. So if you're interested if you have questions about anything in your lawn and garden, you can register for that class on our website. And I will send the links. Thank you.
Thank you all. Have a good rest of your week. We'll see you next time.
If you enjoyed this video, please let us know with your questions, comments, and suggestions for other classes and videos. We can be reached at mastergardener@pwcgov.org. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next week. If you're interested in lawn care, please contact our Best Lawns Coordinator, Natalie Walker, at nwalker@pwcgov.org.